Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the 1920s, the smoke and the jazz and the speakeasy at 2 in the morning and the feeling that the entire world had just survived something unsurvivable and come out the other side, and nobody quite knew what the rules were anymore or whether the old rules had ever been worth keeping. Tonight we're going to talk about a piece of jewellery. A long string of pearls, the kind that hung to the waist, the kind that swung when you danced, the kind that every flapper in every photograph from 1925 seems to be wearing around her neck like a declaration of something. Because it was a declaration, that's exactly what it was, and understanding what it was declaring and what it cost to declare it, and why a generation of young women risked their reputations and sometimes their safety to wear a particular kind of necklace, that's what tonight is about. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps, and we've got a lot more of this kind of thing coming. Alright, let's begin. The year is 1922. You are 22 years old. You are standing in front of a mirror in a boarding house bedroom in Chicago, and you are looking at yourself with the specific quality of attention that a person gives to their own reflection when they are deciding who they intend to be. Your hair is short. This alone, just the hair, would have been enough to make your grandmother weep, and you know this, and you have thought about it, and you have decided that your grandmother's grief about your hair is your grandmother's problem and not yours. You cut it 6 months ago in a barbershop on Michigan Avenue where the barber looked at you with an expression you chose to interpret as professional neutrality and which was probably something closer to alarm. The bob sits just below your ears, clean and precise and entirely absent of the elaborate pinned arrangements that women of your mother's generation spent an hour constructing every morning. You are wearing a dress that ends at the knee. The hem has been rising progressively since 1919. The year the war ended, the year everything ended and everything began simultaneously, and the current position of the hemline, right there at the knee, scandalous by any standard that existed before 1918 and merely fashionable by the standard that is currently being written in real time by girls like you in cities like this, represents a negotiation between how far you want to go and how far the city you are walking through will currently permit. But it's not the hair and it's not the hem that you're looking at. It's the pearls. They are long, or they will be long when you have them. That's the point of tonight. You don't have them yet. You are 22 years old and you work as a typist for an insurance company on Wacker Drive, and you make $18 a week, which is a salary that covers your rent and your food and your trolley fare and leaves approximately nothing for a rope of pearls long enough to swing when you dance, which is the only kind of pearls that matter right now, in this specific moment in history, when the rope of pearls is not merely a piece of jewelry. It is a symbol so loaded with meaning that the women who wear it, and the women who condemn it, and the newspapers that photograph it, and the preachers who denounce it from the pulpit, all of them understand, without needing it explained, exactly what a long rope of pearls around a young woman's neck in 1922 is saying. To understand what it is saying, you have to understand what came before it. Before 1914, pearls meant one specific thing. They meant wealth, old wealth, inherited wealth, the kind of wealth that did not need to announce itself because it had been announcing itself for so long that the announcement had become simply the atmosphere of certain rooms. Real pearls, natural pearls, harvested from oysters in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and the waters around Japan, were among the most expensive materials in the world in the early 20th century. The price was not arbitrary. A natural pearl forms when an irritant, a grain of sand, a parasite, a fragment of shell, enters an oyster, and the oyster responds by coating it, layer by layer, with nacre. The process takes years. The odds of any given oyster producing a pearl of significant size and quality are low. The odds of finding matched pearls, pearls of similar size, similar color, similar luster, suited to be strung together into a necklace, are vastly lower. A single strand of matched natural pearls of 16 inches, the conventional length for a proper pearl necklace in the Edwardian period, might cost the equivalent of a Manhattan townhouse in 1910. A double strand cost more. The long ropes that would become the signature of the 1920s flapper, 30, 40, even 60 inches of pearls hanging to the waist, would have cost, in natural pearls of appropriate quality, more than most American families earned in a decade. Pearls of this quality were not bought, they were inherited. They were passed from mother to daughter with the same formality that accompanied the transfer of property, of title, of name. They were insured, they were locked in safes, they were worn to the kind of events that had guest lists rather than open doors, at the kind of addresses that had doormen rather than stoops, by the kind of women who were photographed in society pages rather than arrested in speakeasy raids. They were, in the language of objects, a declaration of belonging, of having been born into a specific social world, of having a place in it that was not earned or chosen but inherited, as fixed and as unchosen as the colour of your eyes. And then two things happened that changed everything. The first thing was the war. The war ended in November 1918. You were 18 years old when it ended. You were 14 when it began, which means that your entire adolescence, the years in which a person's understanding of what the world is and what it offers is being formed, occurred inside the event that killed approximately 20 million people and wounded 21 million more, and rearranged the social order of Europe and America in ways that nobody had fully mapped yet. The men who went to war came back. Those who came back fundamentally altered. You did not go to war. Women did not go to war in 1914 in the sense of carrying rifles, but you worked. The factories and the offices and the hospitals and the farms that the departed men left behind needed people to run them, and the people available were women, and so women ran them. For 4 years, while the men were gone, women in America and Britain and France worked in munitions factories and drove ambulances and managed offices and performed, in other words, every function of a functioning society. And then the men came back, and the assumption was that women would step aside and return to the domestic arrangements that the pre-war world had considered natural and correct. Some did. Many did, because the economic and social pressures to do so were real and significant, and the alternatives were limited. But something had shifted, something that could not easily be unshifted, in the relationship between women and the idea that their place was defined for them by biology and tradition rather than by choice. The second thing that happened was Mikimoto. Kokichi Mikimoto was a Japanese entrepreneur who had spent the better part of 2 decades attempting to solve the problem of pearl scarcity through cultivation, by deliberately introducing irritants into oysters and farming the resulting pearls rather than searching the ocean floor for naturally occurring ones. He had been working on this since the 1890s. In 1893, he produced his first cultured pearl. By 1908, he had a functioning method. By the early 1920s, cultured pearls were entering the market in quantities that had never before been possible. Cultured pearls are real pearls. This was, and to some extent remains, a contested claim. The natural pearl industry and its wealthy clientele fought vigorously against the idea that a pearl produced with human assistance was equivalent to a pearl produced without it. But the nacre that gives a pearl its luster, its weight, its warmth against the skin, that nacre is produced by the oyster in exactly the same biological process, whether the irritant was introduced by accident or by a Japanese farmer in the Bay of Argo. What Mikimoto's cultured pearls changed was the price. By the mid-1920s, a long rope of cultured pearls, the 30 or 40-inch rope that swung when you danced, that wrapped twice around the neck, that caught the light of the jazz club and the speakeasy, was within the reach of a woman who worked as a typist and made $18 a week if she saved, if she was careful, if she wanted it enough. And you wanted it enough. But why? This is the question that the mirror is asking you in the boarding house bedroom in Chicago in 1922. Why does it matter? It is a piece of jewelry. It is nacre-coated calcium carbonate on a string. Why does possessing it feel like something larger than possession? Because the rope of pearls in 1922 is not a piece of jewelry. It is a theft. Not a literal theft, though some women did steal them, and we'll get to that. A symbolic theft. An appropriation. You are taking an object that belonged by the previous social order's understanding exclusively to women of a specific class, a specific standing, a specific definition of respectable femininity, and you are wearing it while dancing the Charleston in a speakeasy at midnight, while drinking gin from a flask, while smoking a cigarette in public, while wearing a dress that ends at the knee. You are wearing their pearls without their permission, and you are wearing them in all the wrong places, and you are wearing them while being all the wrong kind of woman, and that is precisely the point. The flapper. The word was British originally, applied to young women who were considered shockingly unconventional, and it migrated to America in the early 1920s, where it acquired its specific cultural meaning. The flapper was a figure of enormous cultural anxiety for exactly this reason. She was not simply unfashionable by the old standards. She was actively, deliberately, productively transgressive. Every element of her appearance, the short hair, the raised hemline, the visible makeup, the cigarette, the drink, the late hour, the public space, the male company, was a statement about what she refused to accept as her designated role. The pearls were part of this statement, and they were perhaps the most sophisticated part because they operated as both transgression and aspiration simultaneously. The flapper wearing long pearls was saying two things at once. She was saying, I can have what you have, the things your class has kept for itself, the symbols of your world. And she was also saying, I am going to wear them differently. I am going to wear them dancing. I am going to wear them wrong, and wrong is the point. The women of the established social order who wore short pearl strands to luncheon and to the opera and to church, they understood this message. The newspaper editorials that wrung their hands about the flapper and her loose morals and her inappropriate dress understood it. The pastors who preached against the jazz age understood it. The rope of pearls was a cultural provocation made of nacre and thread. Now let's talk about what it cost. Not the price in dollars, though that was real. What it cost in terms of what you had to navigate, what you had to risk, what you had to absorb to be the woman in 1922 who wore the pearls and danced the Charleston and came home at 3 in the morning. The first cost was your reputation, and in 1922, your reputation was not an abstraction. It was a practical asset with direct economic consequences. The marriage market, and it was a market as explicitly as any commodity exchange, governed by rules and prices and assessments of value that everybody understood and nobody quite said out loud. The marriage market in 1922 was still the primary economic security system available to most women. A woman who did not marry was a woman who worked for the rest of her life on whatever wages the employment market would offer a woman, which were wages calibrated in the assumption that women's work was supplementary rather than primary, that women were working until they married rather than working as a permanent condition of life. The woman who was known to frequent speakeasies, who was seen dancing with men she was not engaged to, who came home at hours that neighbours noticed, who wore the rope of pearls and the short skirt and the short hair. This woman's reputation in the marriage market was damaged in ways that had direct financial implications. The kind of men who had the kind of money that marriage was supposed to provide were, in 1922, still largely the kind of men who wanted a wife whose reputation was unimpeachable by the standards of their mothers. You know this. You are 22 in 1922, and you have grown up in a world that has been explaining this to you since you were old enough to understand the word reputation. You know the math. You know what the short hair and the late nights and the pearls are costing you in terms of the specific social calculation that your mother runs in her head every time she thinks about your future. You have decided, provisionally and with some anxiety, and with the full awareness that the decision is reversible in some directions and not in others, that you are going to make the trade. That what you gain, the dancing, the freedom, the specific feeling of being in a jazz club at midnight with the music doing what jazz does to the body, is worth what you lose. This is not a small decision. Do not let anyone tell you it was easy or obvious, or that the women who made it were not genuinely risking something real. They were. The flapper's transgression was real transgression, not costume. The rope of pearls cost something beyond dollars. The second cost was physical safety, and this is the part of the 1920s story that gets told less often than the glamour. The speakeasy was not a safe space in the way that modern people use that phrase. It was an illegal establishment operating in violation of the Volstead Act, which had implemented prohibition in January 1920, and it was therefore operating in the space between legality and criminality that was controlled not by any legitimate authority, but by the organized crime structures that supplied the alcohol. The Prohibition-era speakeasy was, in most major American cities, a business that paid protection to a criminal organization. In Chicago, that organization in the early 1920s was in the process of being consolidated under figures who would become historically famous for their violence. The environment of the speakeasy was not uniformly dangerous. Most nights in most establishments the patrons drank and danced and went home. But it was an environment in which violence was possible in ways that a licensed establishment with police accountability was not. The women who frequented speakeasies absorbed this risk knowingly. They traveled in groups where possible, developed relationships with specific establishments where the proprietors were known quantities, learned which neighborhoods and which hours were manageable and which were not. They developed, in other words, the same practical risk management strategies that women in any era develop when navigating environments that do not guarantee their safety. The police raids were an additional hazard. Prohibition was imperfectly enforced. Many police precincts in major cities were on the payrolls of the criminal organizations they were nominally pursuing, but raids did happen, and being arrested in a speakeasy raid was an event with consequences that fell differently on different participants. A man arrested in a speakeasy raid was, in 1922, broadly, a man who had been somewhere illegal and had bad luck. A woman arrested in a speakeasy raid was, in 1922, broadly, a woman whose presence in that environment was itself evidence of the kind of moral character that the arrest confirmed. The legal system of 1922 did not treat women and men equivalently in this regard. The double standard was not subtle. It was not pretending to be subtle. It was the explicit operating framework of the era's social judgment. You wore the pearls anyway. Let's talk about the pearls specifically now. The physical object. What it was made of. Why it looked the way it looked. Why the length mattered. A cultured pearl is produced when a technician opens an oyster and inserts a nucleus, typically a bead made from the shell of a freshwater mussel, along with a small piece of mantle tissue from a donor oyster. The oyster responds to this irritant by coating the nucleus with nacre, the same crystalline calcium carbonate and protein structure that produces natural pearls. Over the next 2 to 5 years, layers of nacre accumulate around the nucleus, building up the pearl. The luster of a pearl, the quality that makes it different from every other gemstone, the warm, soft, almost luminous glow from within, is produced by the interaction of light with the thin, overlapping layers of nacre. Light penetrates the outer layers of nacre and reflects back from the deeper layers, and the interference between these multiple reflected beams produces the iridescent depth that no other material quite replicates. A pearl glows rather than sparkles, and the glow comes from depth rather than from surface, and this quality is what makes pearls visible in the low light of a jazz club in a way that many other stones are not. The length of the flapper's pearl rope was not arbitrary. The conventional Edwardian pearl necklace, the strand worn by your mother's generation, was 16 inches, sitting just below the collar, formal and contained and close to the body, decorative but not kinetic. It did not move in any significant way when the wearer moved. It sat as decorously as the wearer was supposed to sit. The flapper's rope was 30, 40, sometimes 60 inches. It hung to the waist. It swung. When you danced the Charleston, the dance that became synonymous with the era, with its wide lateral leg movements and its arms swinging and its entire body committed to a kind of joyful, almost reckless physicality, the pearls swung with you. They were kinetic, they were part of the dancing, part of the movement, impossible to separate from the body that was moving. This was the point. The pearls that moved were pearls that declared movement. The pearls that swung were pearls that declared the right to swing. The pearls that crossed the body from shoulder to waist in a long rope were pearls that traced the body, that drew the eye along the length of a body that the short dress was also declaring in its refusal of the floor-length coverage that previous fashion had maintained. The long rope of pearls was, in the language of dress, a celebration of the female body in motion. It was the opposite of the corset, which had been declining since the early 1910s, and which the flapper generation largely abandoned. The corset that compressed and controlled and shaped the body into a specific form of respectable femininity. The corset that the pearls replaced as the central item of feminine self-presentation. Instead of a garment that controlled the body from the outside, a necklace that moved with it. There is another dimension to the pearls that is worth understanding, and it is the dimension that connects them to the specific historical moment of the 1920s in a way that goes beyond fashion. The women of the flapper generation were the first generation of women in American history for whom higher education was becoming genuinely accessible, for whom professional employment was becoming socially acceptable, for whom the vote, granted by the 19th Amendment in 1920, 2 years before you are standing in front of this mirror, was a legal reality. They were also the first generation to grow up in a world that had demonstrated, with approximately 20 million bodies, that the old order was not invincible. The European civilization that had educated everyone in the primacy of its own values and the rightness of its own social arrangements had just spent 4 years destroying itself with an efficiency that suggested something was wrong with the premise. The 1920s were not simply a decade of hedonism. They were a decade of renegotiation, a period in which every social arrangement that the war had demonstrated was contingent was being actively questioned: the role of women, the class system, the authority of the church, the prohibition of alcohol, which was itself a product of progressive reformism and which produced, in its failure, a decade-long lesson in the limits of legislative morality, the relationship between the generations, the definition of respectable. The rope of pearls participated in this renegotiation as a specific symbol of class crossing, of taking something that had belonged to one social category and refusing to leave it there. When natural pearl prices collapsed in the late 1920s, collapsed dramatically by as much as 85% in some markets, because the cultured pearl supply had broken the monopoly that natural pearls had maintained on the luxury market. The women who had built their sense of self around natural pearl ownership felt this collapse as something more than a financial loss. They felt it as a symbolic loss. What had distinguished them, what had been the visible marker of their particular position in the social order, could now be purchased by anyone. This was, from the flapper's perspective, the goal. Not the financial ruin of wealthy women, but the disruption of the system that said certain things belonged to certain people by right of birth rather than by right of choice or effort or desire. The desire is what we keep coming back to, the wanting. You are 22 years old in a boarding house bedroom in Chicago in 1922, and you want the pearls with an intensity that you find slightly embarrassing if you examine it too closely. You want them the way you want the music and the dancing and the 2 in the morning and all of it, with a hunger that feels like it is about more than any specific thing you can name. It is about more than any specific thing you can name. That is the nature of what desire actually is when it is connected to something real about who you are and what you need. It is not reducible to a list of concrete reasons. It is the whole weight of who you have been told to be pressing against the whole weight of who you want to be, and the pressure between those two things is looking for an outlet, and the outlet right now, in this specific historical moment, is a long rope of cultured pearls swinging at waist level in a jazz club on a Tuesday night. This is why the women who could not afford the real thing bought the fake. The 1920s were also the decade in which imitation pearls, glass beads coated with a luminous finish, or later with a preparation called essence d'Orient made from fish scales that produced a remarkably convincing pearl luster, became mass-market products available in 5 and dime stores across America. A long rope of imitation pearls cost cents, not dollars. The visual effect in the low light of a speakeasy was, to most observers, indistinguishable from the real thing. The question of whether to wear real or imitation was a question about what, exactly, the pearls were for. If they were for status in the old sense, for the actual communication of actual wealth to actual wealthy people who could distinguish real from fake, then imitation pearls were a failure, a pretense, a humiliation. But the women who bought imitation pearls in Woolworths were not trying to communicate with the people who could distinguish real from fake at 20 paces. They were communicating something else, to a different audience in a different language. They were communicating membership in a generation. in a moment. In a specific, defiant, joyful, historically brief cultural movement that was saying, collectively, in the language of hemlines and hair and dancing and smoke and pearls, real and imitation swinging together in the dark, we are here and we are not what you told us we were going to be. The imitation pearl was, in this context, just as true as the real one. Both were saying the same thing, only the price of saying it was different. The decade ended badly. They often do, the decades that burn this brightly. The stock market crash of October 1929 did not simply end an economic era, it ended a cultural moment, abruptly, brutally, with a completeness that made the 1920s feel, in retrospect, like something that had happened in another world. The depression that followed demanded a different register. The exuberance that the 1920s had been constructed from, the specific, almost reckless quality of delight that a generation of people who had survived something unsurvivable had brought to the task of being alive. That exuberance was not available to a people who were watching banks fail and breadlines form, and the entire material scaffolding of their lives being dismantled around them. The flapper, as a recognizable cultural type, did not survive the 1920s. She did not disappear because the social forces that had produced her were defeated. She transformed, because transformation is what cultural movements do when the specific conditions that produce them change. The short hair stayed shorter than it had been before 1920. The hemlines rose and fell with fashion, but they never returned to the pre-war floor. Women continued to work in larger numbers with less apology. The vote, won in 1920, remained. The legal and social space for women's public life, expanded by the 1920s experiment, did not fully contract again. The pearls, the long ropes, the dancing ropes became less ubiquitous as the 1930s demanded a different aesthetic. But they did not disappear. They became vintage. They became glamorous in a different way. The way that something that carries the memory of a specific moment becomes charged with that moment's meaning. You can still buy them. Long ropes of cultured pearls, swinging to the waist, exactly as they were in 1922. They are not expensive. They are widely available. No one is scandalized by them. No one preaches from the pulpit about what they represent. This is what victory looks like sometimes. Not a triumphal declaration. Just the quiet, ordinary availability of the thing that was once transgressive. Just the fact that a young woman can put on a long rope of pearls and think nothing particular about it, because the battle that the pearl rope was fighting has been fought, and the outcome has been absorbed into the normal. The women who wore them in 1922 would find this banal victory enormously satisfying. They wore them precisely so that the women who came after them wouldn't have to think about it. You are still standing in front of the mirror in the boarding house bedroom. The rope of pearls is not around your neck yet. You are still saving for it. 3 more weeks of careful budgeting, of brown bag lunches and trolley fare instead of taxis, and it will be yours. You know what you are going to do with it when you have it. You are going to go to the Green Mill on Broadway, where the jazz is real and the gin is better than it should be given the circumstances. And you are going to dance until 2 in the morning with the pearls swinging at your waist. And you are not going to think about what your mother thinks or what your grandmother would think or what the preacher said last Sunday or what the newspapers have been saying about girls like you for the past 3 years. You are going to think about the music and the movement and the way the pearls catch the light when you turn. That is what you are risking everything for. That specific moment. That specific feeling, that specific declaration, made in nacre and motion, that you are here and you are alive, and the world that told you exactly what you were supposed to be got it wrong. 3 more weeks. It will be worth it. In 1917, Pierre Cartier purchased his famous 5-story mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York by trading it for a double strand of natural pearls. The pearls were valued at $1 million. By 1935, cultured pearls had driven the value of natural pearls down by more than 85%. The mansion still stands. The pearls are gone. If you watched this far, let me know where you're tuning in from. Consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.